can hear me, right? Yes, okay, good. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Dan Hamilton. I'm a professor here at SAIS, and I direct the Center for Transatlantic Relations. We have been engaged over the last number of years in a project with the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP is called, and the Robert Bosch Foundation, it's a German foundation, to look at relations between East and West. Now, and when I say East and West now, I mean Eastern Europe, Russia, and Western Europe, the United States. So for about a year, 2 years ago, we did a whole project whether there was a Western consensus at all on how we deal with Europe's East, whether we even understand what's happening in the East, including Russia. And that resulted in a book we put out called The Eastern Question, which is on our website, and it's available through Brookings if anyone's interested in it. And we have mainly Western authors from Europe and the United States looking at that question: do we actually agree on the analysis of what's happening and how we can approach that? So it has a number of chapters by authors, and it's a focus on the West. But last year, we went through a second, different exercise, and the idea here was let's feature authors and voices from the East. So we had a number of meetings in Kyiv and other capitals in Eastern Europe, and the idea was to feature Eastern voices, because often I think, particularly in Washington, but also in much of Western Europe, just hearing the straight, unvarnished, perspective from Eastern European specialists and experts isn't quite, part of the debate as it should be. So that's what we're doing here today. Is we put together this book called Eastern Voices, and it's kind of a reality check in a way for the first book, because our authors were asked, well, what do you think of these Western ideas? And they told us. And so we tried to feature in this book a number of authors from, when I say Eastern Europe, I mean sort of the non-EU, non-NATO part of Europe that's also not Russia. So what the EU would call the Eastern Partnership countries, but includes Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. So we have authors from those countries in this book, and the idea was to present that type of perspective and also recommendations. So it's not just an academic and analytical book, it's also recommendations of how we should work together. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But before I turn to our colleagues, we actually have a third phase of it, which is on Russia. And we've done the same thing now with Russian colleagues. So in January, it's at the printer right now, we will have yet a third book in this series, which we call the Russia File. And it is mainly Russian authors, also on the same topic, but given their perspective. It's an eclectic group of authors. It's not, say, regime authors only, but it includes those close to the current government, but it also includes some Russian critics, and it includes a number of Western experts on Russia who try to present also some Russian perspectives on not only European relations, but Russia's activities in the Middle East, how to think about Russia and China, and other types of global issues that Russia is engaged in. So we will do a release event on that book in January, but just to give you a sense of kind of how this series is evolving. And this coming year, we're involved in a new effort, which will be more of a foresight exercise, in which we create narratives of the future, and we want to put decision makers from Russia, Western Europe, and the United States in the room together and say, here's the future, what do you do? So rather than exchange analyses, actually say, how could we work together on these things? So you see, it's a broad project, and today we're really pleased that Oleksiy Haran is here, one of our authors for the Eastern Voices and book, and Oleksiy has been engaged in this overall project. Oleksiy and a colleague have a chapter in this book, I think a very strong one, in which they give analysis of the Ukrainian situation, but also Ukrainian expectations of the West. And I think that's an important debate that we should have. I think as advertised, I think people know Oleksiy Haran is a professor, and he's a founding director of the School of Policy Analysis at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. I think people who follow Ukraine know Oleksiy well. He's a really distinguished expert on these issues over many years and has a list of publications. I think he's a go-to analyst if you want to understand what the dynamics are in that part of the world. So I'm going to turn to Oleksiy to give us his view on things. But let me just say before we do that, we have a program with it's called the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation. And each year we have at least two fellows in a competitive process that come and spend a year with us. And often the focus is on Central and Eastern Europe. So this year we're really delighted that Mykola Vorobiov is here as our Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Fellow. Mykola is also Ukrainian. He's just spent 3 years, I think, on the front lines in the Donbass, and really has a lot of ground truth that he can bring to this discussion because he's really been spending a lot of time right on the ground. And he has a new piece that we just posted from our center on why the Euromaidan was not the last revolution for Ukraine. So that's a rather provocative sort of assertion. We'll let him explain that. But Oleksiy, let me turn to you. And as I said, our book is intended somewhat as a reality check for Westerners on whether our ideas are even relevant to the East. You see the subtitle, Europe's East Faces an Unsettled West. Part of the first book says half the problem is in the West, not actually in the East. And we have to get our acts together in the West as well if we're going to do anything seriously with our Eastern colleagues. So, but I'll let Oleksiy take it from here and offer his views.
Thank you very much. I'll stay with there. Okay, does it? No?
I think it's this mic on your time.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, I will stay because it would mean that I will not sleep. Actually, I came a very long way, starting from Guangzhou, China, Kyiv, and here, so it's about 15 hours difference. But I'm happy that I've made it, and thank you very much for inviting and for possibility to participate in this project. I will start maybe with some broad picture of the changes which influences Ukraine, and the changes are connected not only to Eastern Europe per se, but also regarding our borderland, Ukrainian borderland, which is Central Europe. I mean, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and also partially Western Europe, because in all these parts of the world we see the rising of populism, and a lot of things have changed, not for the better, though these changes are not as worse as they were predicted, say, a year ago. But nevertheless, it creates a lot of additional challenges for Eastern Europe and for those countries which are united under the title Eastern Partnership of the European Union. So if we analyze the changes which happened in Central Europe, I would refer you to one of the articles in this book, which was written by one of the leading European intellectuals, Ivan Krastev, from Bulgaria, but I think he's not only from Bulgaria, he's a citizen of Europe. And he wrote that in 1989, actually there were two 1989s. One was a year of democratic cosmopolitans like Václav Havel and Adam Michnik, and the other, 1989, was the year of such people as Kaczynski brothers and others like them. And we see now the presence of these people at the highest echelons of in their countries, and actually you see the position of such people as Kaczynski, as Orban, as Czech President Zeman, very populist, very I will not say pro-Russian, but in rhetoric, sometimes you may hear pro-Russia overtones. And just an example, Ukraine now has serious problems with Poland regarding historical memory of both countries, the politics of historic memory, and, well, I wouldn't say it's a problem per se, but the problem is how it may influence, for example, Ukrainian-Polish strategic relations, because to our mind, Poland pays too much attention to the history, which could prevent from developing relations necessary for today's situation. But I think we can overcome it. We can overcome, and there was a recent meeting of President Duda and President Poroshenko in Kharkiv, and there are signs that actually both parties would stick to the idea of strategic partnership. Also, I think that it would be premature to say that these issues will not influence Polish-Ukrainian relations. They will influence, especially given the situation of upcoming elections in Poland. So the present Polish government will play on this card of historic memory. We have some problems connected with the adoption in Ukraine of the language on the law on the language of instruction in secondary schools and higher schools. And basically, we've solved these issues because there were accusations in Poland, in Romania. We basically overcame these differences with Poland, and to a great extent with Romania. We still have these problems with Hungary. And Hungary actually applied to Venice Commission, saying that Venice Commission is to check Ukrainian law on education, and Ukraine said, okay, we are going also to apply to Venice Commission for that. And Venice Commission made recommendation, and again, this recommendation is more or less okay for Ukrainian side, because it says there is a room for compromise. So I would again say that here Ukraine would overcome these difficulties with Hungary. Also, again, Hungary will play on that issue. The most difficult part for Ukraine, if we take recommendations of the Venice Commission, is that it actually says that there would be problems with instruction in Russian language in Ukraine. And I think that in reality there wouldn't be such strong problems with that. There wouldn't be any protests in Ukraine regarding the diminishing of number of classes which study in the Russian language. But the Venice Commission points out to that, because the Venice Commission is democratic institution, and Ukraine is to fulfill the recommendations of the Venice Commission. So we'll see what will come out of this. So Ukraine will need to react to that. In general, if you are talking about this region, which I called Eastern Partnership, we see definitely two groups of the countries. One group is Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, which with all the problems, but nevertheless they have association agreement with the EU, they have visa-free regime. All the countries have very serious domestic challenges and the activization of pro-Russian forces, but nevertheless they are performing their homework. To what extent this could be debated. And we have the other countries which are not striving for association agreement with the EU, which do not have this idea of joining the EU. So it's actually very difficult to find a common denominator for all these two groups of countries. Recently there was a summit, Eastern Partnership Summit, in Brussels, and we know that President Lukashenko was also invited to that. He declined it. And Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, they wanted that there would be some specification in the decision of the summit, saying that creating some kind of Eastern Partnership Plus. specifically for Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. So I believe that actually there's no tragedy about that, because I think, again, all of these countries, they have their formula of relations with the EU, which is association agreements, which are to be performed, and this is actually a roadmap for all these countries. What can still, I believe that those countries which are in Eastern Partnerships, they have something in common, and something may be used also for the West in order to continue different projects, common projects regarding this region. And because I came from China, I would like to draw your attention to the Chinese idea of New Silk Road, or One Road, One Belt. And we know that now transit routes from China are going from Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus to Europe, but there could be also possibility for alternative route, which goes via those countries that we called Guam: Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Ukraine. And for many years, actually, Guam wasn't active, and there wasn't enough background for additional activity among these countries. But now I think these ideas of transit route, which will go through these countries, may be revived and may become a potential for increased cooperation in the region, and also Western influence regarding this potential transit route. Now, let me come to Ukraine, which I know better, and the situation now, I would say, it's very difficult to, in Ukraine there's a very popular hashtag, which is betrayal or victory. So every event is assessed whether it's betrayal or it's a victory, which is definitely simplification, because many things cannot be analyzed just, saying yes, no, good or bad. The country is moving, but with zigzags, and definitely the country faces a lot of problems regarding implementation of reforms. Unfortunately, there are very influential forces within the parliament, within the government, actually within every minister, within every ministry, within everybody. You have a fight, very intensive fight between those people who would like to promote reforms and those people who are block reforms. So sometimes it's very difficult to say this body or agency, is it pro-reform or anti-reform? But we see these problems, and unfortunately now Ukrainian authorities, and I include here parliament and government and president, sometimes they are trying, to use manipulations, not really democratic procedures, to discredit their enemies, opposition, or even civil society. For example, you know that one of the gains of Ukrainian civil society was that the electronic declaration was introduced for public servants. But empire struck back. So, and the parliament decided to introduce electronic declarations also for activists from NGO sectors, which are fighting corruption, So the idea is, okay, you are going to check us, okay, fine. So we are going to check you, how transparent you are. But definitely it's very difficult to compare, because in one case you are talking about state money, how they are spent and allocated, and in another case you are talking actually about the money of Western donors, and all NGOs, organizations which receive this support, they go through very tough procedures, and all of you know these procedures, how it's difficult to report to donors. But nevertheless, Ukrainian authorities decided that it would be good to check these NGOs again. And I think it's not so for tax administration, because anyway, all this information is submitted to tax authorities. But the idea is to make it public, so in order then to manipulate it and to say, oh, this guy is criticizing the government, but look, he's earning Western money, and there's quite a lot money. So I see this as an example of one of these manipulation which shows that the ruling elite is not happy with those changes which are imposed now by civil society and support of the West. So what to do in this situation? In this situation, I believe it's necessary to continue basically the strategy which Dan Hamilton and Stephen Meister, they depicted as sandwich strategy for the West, which means that there are Ukrainian authorities and there are civil society and the West, and from both sides you have the pressure on Ukrainian authorities to move forward. And there is a potential to move forward despite all the problems which exist. Now, regarding do we have reformist forces, political reformist forces, which we can easily define and to say that, well, ruling elite is bad, but we have alternative. And unfortunately, I would say that this would be difficult, actually, to say that we have really new counter-elite which is politically united and which can present alternative to the present ruling elite, because definitely what we see is we have many different groups, but most of them are populists. Most of them are actually not new but old, like Tymoshenko and her party Batskivshina. And the new political projects, like Samopomich, for example, actually, playing populist game as well, unfortunately. And if we analyze Saakashvili, then we will see that he's playing very destabilizing role in Ukrainian politics. Unfortunately, I think it was a mistake to invite him to Ukraine and to use him, to give him some possibility to influence Ukrainian politics. I'm not talking about the whole Georgian team, because again, I think people are different within this Georgian team, and there are people who made some important contribution for transformation, but there are people who actually associated with Saakashvili who can do nothing except for talking and destabilizing situation. Again, I think it was a mistake from Ukrainian president to deprive him of Ukrainian citizenship. I'm not talking about legal issues, but politically, basically, there was no much room for maneuver for Saakashvili. The rating of his Ruch Novых Sil, which is movement of new forces, the rating of this movement was about 1.5, so quite low. And basically Saakashvili was becoming more and more invisible for Ukrainian public. But then, he appeared in like fish in the water, because he likes scandals, and the scandal was created. So, and he managed it to the full extent. He is master of doing these things, and now, he's kind of TV star, not only for Ukrainian channels, but also for the world. I'm giving request from Al Jazeera to comment on Saakashvili, and about his role in Ukrainian politics. What the recent polls are showing? Actually, the recent polls, nevertheless, they show that Saakashvili didn't get much, nevertheless, and if the elections are held now, his force would not be represented in the parliament. That is, they will not overcome 5% threshold. Different polls. I've checked it just, today's morning, so I checked different polls. They show that they do not overcome the barrier. But what would be the result of parliamentary elections? The result of parliamentary elections would show that basically in the first place would be Batskivshina of Tymoshenko. And then comes Poroshenko and other forces which are mainly represented in the present government, in the present parliament, with exception of Народный Front, People's Front, and civic platform of Mr. Gritsenko would appear in the new parliament as well. So there would be no much changes, but the new parliament would be fragmented and polarized. And that's the reason against early elections, political reason against it, because it would be even more difficult to form the new coalition in the parliament. So I think it's better to let this parliament to survive until the regular elections, and we see that even in this situation, the present parliament, also the ruling coalition de facto lacks majority, but nevertheless they may get situational majority, having situative alliance with this or that force. If we are talking about presidential elections, then again, we have two main competitors, not new faces, Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, and perhaps Vakarchuk, famous Ukrainian rock musician and singer, and nice guy, actually. I consider him to be a patriot, to be an honest guy, but the problem is that he doesn't have political experience at all. So what is interesting? The interesting thing is that he never announced that he is going to run for president. Even recently he wrote a post for Ukrainska Pravda, and he didn't say that I'm going to run for presidency. But the pollsters are including him in the polls. So he is number third with quite substantial number of votes. There are some rumors that actually it may become good for Poroshenko because Vakarchuk may seize some part of the votes which otherwise would go to Tymoshenko. And if there would be in the runoff Poroshenko and Vakarchuk, in this case it would be easier for Poroshenko to defeat Vakarchuk because at this point, again, Vakarchuk may be depicted as non-professional, as there could be a lot of disinformation campaigns, so maybe it could play into the hands of Poroshenko. This is one theory. Also, I think that anyway, for Poroshenko, it would be very difficult to beat Tymoshenko or Vakarchuk because now Poroshenko is not popular. Okay, so people may vote against Poroshenko. Still, I believe that, polls are one thing, and when people are coming to the polls, this is different. So basically, Poroshenko still has some chances to be re-elected. Do I have some time to talk about?
Yeah, briefly, if you can.
Briefly.
Because we
Okay.
can continue the discussion.
Yeah. Let me just give you an example regarding how difficult sometimes it is to promote things to promote some laws. And here I would talk about, as an example, about the law on changes in electoral system. Because it's highly recommended for Ukraine to change our system to open party slates. This is a kind of system which you don't have. You're not as progressive as Ukraine may become. But for Ukraine, why is it important? Because this would actually structure Ukrainian parliament, the using of party slates, and it would diminish the so-called administrative resource, which is very actively played in majoritarian districts. Still, the problem, and I supported actually this idea from, I don't remember, the end of 90s, because the idea is very progressive, to have open party slates. Now in Ukraine, there's a mixed system. So you have half elected on party slates and half elected on in majoritarian districts, which gives possibility for anybody who is in power to use the second part of the voting system in order to improve his situation regarding elections on party slates. So basically it's beneficial for those who is in power. So it's not surprising that Poroshenko de facto is sticking to this system, and opposition, including new faces, they are in favor of open party slates. And as I have said to you, I was supportive of it. But if we analyze the political results of introduction of such a system, it would mean actually that the number for those parties which are populists and not really democratic, or even opposition bloc, would increase for the next parliament. So in Syria, this is good. Whether it will play into the hands of stability and democratic development is questionable. Finally, maybe some things on Donbass. Ukrainians are very critical of Minsk agreements. And all the polls, they show that if Ukrainians are asked, are they in favor of compromises, or at least some compromises to move forward, most Ukrainians would say yes. So Ukrainians are realists. They are not in favor of military solution, which is impossible, and they are not in favor of all compromises which are written actually in Minsk agreements. So they are for selective use of potential compromises. But if the Ukrainians are asked specifically, okay, what compromises would you agree? Would you agree to special status of the occupied areas? No. Would you agree to elections in the occupied areas? No. Would you agree to amnesty? Full amnesty? No. And so on and so forth. Which means actually that it would be very difficult for any Ukrainian government to push forward with implementation of political part of Minsk agreements. Luckily, I believe, in the West do understand it right now, because a year and a half, there was a huge pressure on Ukraine. Don't wait for ceasefire. Don't wait for withdrawal of heavy weapons. Let's move with political part, which is actually contrary to what is written in Minsk agreements. But I believe that now the West accepts basically, Ukrainian position, that security must come first, and only then we are ready to implement some part of political measures, which again would be quite difficult given the attitude of Ukrainian public. The role of the West here, now we are talking about peacekeepers. Okay, frankly, I think that it's not very realistic, this scenario, and definitely there are different interpretations of what everybody means by peacekeepers. Russian interpretation is totally different from Ukrainian one and from the Western one, but basically I think it's possible to move with that. And here there is some room for compromise, because if we are talking that there would be not only international peacekeepers, but also transitional administration, for example, transitional UN administration, that may be accepted by Ukrainian public. So it would be easier to move with that. And in Ukraine, it's very popular actually to use the example of Croatia. So how Croatians liberated the territories. But sometimes it was forgotten previously. Now it's mentioned that there is also another example of Eastern Slavonia in Croatia where exactly this approach was used. So having peacekeepers and having UN transitional administration. Although, again, it was for very specific period, for 2 years. Again, it's difficult for me to imagine how, even with transitional administration in the Donbass, it would be possible to solve the situation in 2 years. But at least here, I see some possibility for finding compromises for which Ukrainian public would be ready. Perhaps I will stop here. I have something more to say,
right.
But okay.
There's time,
Yeah.
but we'd like to include others. So let me ask, before we turn to the discussions, Mykola, just for some comment, either on what he's heard, but also we ended on the Donbass. Mykola, you spent some time there. Just your impression of where we are, please. You can be there or there, what's best for you.
I will try to be brief. Dear colleagues, dear friends, Professor Haran, thanks for coming. Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Aslan, thanks very much. And it's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for your interest. And we were discussing it before the event, but it's not about the number, but about the quality of audience. So thanks very much for your involvement, especially on this Christmas week. So I'm not from actually academic community. That's probably was selected for this program because I want to bring some journalistic experience, some experience as an activist from Ukraine. So basically, just trying to be brief. First of all, I like this book, which was written by the most distinguished experts from the region. But I would like just to bring you to the roots of these current developments in Ukraine. And Professor Haran, he mentioned about, the society is divided between betrayal, zrada, and victory, perimoga. So some of society, I would say half of society, they say this government, they work for Kremlin. And another say this government, they work from the West. That's it. And basically, that's the main, the main challenge for the country. So I would like to try to stay on the middle between these factors. Because I agree with Professor Haran, because he said it's difficult to judge only from one point. But basically, in my article, I argue, the recent one, which you can get at the desk, I argue that the Euromaidan, so as an active participant of Orange Revolution in 2004 and active Euromaidan in 2013, 2014, I would argue that it was not these events, they were not the revolutions, including the Euromaidan. So basically, but if we compare to this revolution, I call it uprising. If we compare these two uprising, I would say that, of course, this Orange Revolution was peaceful, and Euromaidan was very bloody. So we say about 100 people were killed, like few hundred people were killed on Maidan. I think that up to 1,000 people were killed, and a lot of them still missed, so we can't find them. And Poroshenko, as a president, so we can judge him from different point, but he was not a product of this uprising. He was not a leader of this uprising. Rather, he was a product of compromise between the West, between Kremlin, and between oligarchs. So basically, he was appointed by this small circle, and everybody knows about these negotiations in Vienna, and that's how he became a president. So in the beginning of revolution, his ratings was about like 3, maybe 5%. And then 54.7% people voted for him on the elections in May 2014. That's the reason, and people, after paying such a high price, and still paying the high price in Ato, in the war zone, where at least 10,000 people were killed, they still have very high expectations from the president and from the current leadership. But the system hasn't been changed yet. And so that's probably the root between this, why the society is so divided, because people, activists, including on the streets, they say this government should do much more, and it could have done much more than it did before for these 3 years. And that's why I mentioned in my article, they say, I mean, the issues about corruptions, the issues about like trade with aggressor, the issues about making money in Russia of the president and his factories, and a lot. So basically, those people who already paid a high price, who lost their relatives, who lost their friends, either on Maidan, on the front lines, of course, they have a very high expectation from this leadership, and they want some radical changes. And basically, the problem, the serious question is right now about that during the revolution in 2013, the society was very good people, Europeans versus evil. So say all like open-minded, like Western-minded people versus Yanukovych and his circle. And right now the situation is much complicated because some of people they support current government. Some of them they support like local oligarchs or some local leadership. Some of them they support like any other organization. That's why. So the society is very divided right now, and it corresponds to the elections. So if election takes place like next month or in spring, so basically no one party will take a majority. So according to the recent polls, which was conducted by KMIS, I mean, it's a well-known think tank and polling organization in Ukraine. So Yulia Tymoshenko, yes, she is winning the elections, but she is taking only about 9, maybe 10%. The last parties, they just divide, they have at least, so they are on the threshold, like 3-5%, not more. So the society, people are very frustrated about politicians. People don't trust politicians. And the most trustful people right now in Ukraine are either volunteers or leaders of battalions or any other people in the military. So just to conclude, I think that the revolution is not, and most of activists and most people from I heard from the ground in eastern Ukraine, especially, they say that the revolution is not over yet. It's extended by the military aggression from Russia. And of course, from the government, I mean, we understand the Putin's ambitions just to conquer Ukraine, to make it a failed state, to turn it back to his sphere of influence. But it seems that the Russians, they somehow, militarily, they stepped back, but they still keep the water boiled in the eastern Ukraine. But they're waiting, they learn from the history, like it was 100 years ago, when there was, when the threat of Bolsheviks has declined. It was a fighting inside Ukraine between different groups of interns, between different clans, and between even different oligarchs. That's why right now, so basically, if Putin moves back this military threat, which united oligarchs, including those people who hated each other because nobody wanted to be a part of Russia. Right now, Russians are waiting what would happen if there is no military threat. So they are waiting for some destabilization from within. And of course, on the governmental side, it's also very perfect excuse saying, like before the West, before the civil society, before their people, that, okay, if you are going to protest, if you are going to destabilize, like Misha did, or anybody, Saakashvili or any others, so they label everybody like Kremlin's agents because you want to disrupt the situation from within, you work for Kremlin and so forth. And the same situation before the West, because of lack of reforms, lack of fighting corruption, because we have this military threat. You should support us because Putin will conquer us or something like this. So I don't think that this is a smart strategy because first of all, just to deter the further Russian invasion, I think that we should build a very strong European country, make reforms and fight the corruption. Because otherwise it could be another source or another reason for other uprising, especially from those people like who already were on Maidan, were on the front lines, and of course they won't be scared of Berkut or in the special forces or other or something like this. But for a conclusion, of course, a lot of reforms, I mean, I can say, so this was like mostly like people like who are on the betrayal side, they think, and people who are on the victory side. Of course, we have a non-visa regime right now. We have reforms in energy sector, so we just cut our dependency from the Russian Gazprom. And of course, the society has changed because it won't be mentally, because many people, they paid so high price in the war zone, especially civil society, active people, we won't be in Russia anymore. So I think another like benefit, so by his invading in 2014, Putin encouraged Ukrainians first in their history, probably in their recent history, to build a political nation. Because before the Soviet Union has collapsed in 1991, before this, I would say, Euromaidan revolution, we were still a USSR. And now we are observing the building of political nations, Ukrainians who just realize themselves Ukrainians, and many people who were Russian speakers before, especially in eastern and southern Ukraine, so they shift to Ukrainian language, so they learn more about Ukrainian cultures and so forth, especially those people who sacrifice on the front lines. So basically, that's the positive reason, I would say, of this conflict. And of course, this the support of NATO membership, it increased by 25 or 30%, especially on those Russian-speaking territories, because like before the invasion, it was about 25% of support of NATO integration. Now it's more than 50%. So I would probably stop here. If you want, just like maybe just to bring this to Q&A, and I will be glad to answer to all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I have very, very brief,
sure.
brief
Yes.
reaction? 2 points. First of all, when we say that Orange Revolution was peaceful and Euromaidan violent, let's not forget that actually Euromaidan was peaceful for 2.5 months. That's really important because we have this picture, you know, of blood in the Euromaidan, but for 2.5 months it was totally peaceful, unless it came to the anti-constitutional laws of January 16th, and then the violence erupted. Second point about Poroshenko. Well, I think that actually his election as president was to a certain extent the product of Euromaidan. Why? Because during Euromaidan, position of those 3 leaders of opposition, Klitschko, Yatsenyuk, and Tyagnybok, was quite unpopular. So previously, Klitschko was, you know, #1 as a leader, but his position was quite unpopular. He was much criticized. And that created the room for a new old face like Poroshenko. Poroshenko was a member of Euromaidan movement. He was on the scene of Euromaidan. He supported it financially. So he really benefited, but he didn't take responsibility for unpopular actions which were done by the leaders of opposition. So again, Euromaidan created a new situation where previous leaders lost and the possibility for Poroshenko was created.
Okay, so I think we can open it to discussion, and I think, do we have Mike? I'm not sure that we do. So I think we can all speak up, all right? So, Anders. Can we just say who you are so everyone can identify?
Transatlantic Council. Thank you very much. I think that you're giving a very accurate picture of it, and it's not pretty. It reminds me of Poland in October '81, when one knew that there would be something bad coming, that this can't succeed. And the sense is really, this is not going anywhere. In the last 2 months, we have seen that the president and his group have clearly claimed, the president and his group, that the president and his group have clearly clamped down on any attempt to build rule of law. So we can see there won't be any independent anti-corruption court now. Independent anti-corruption bureau is under heavy attack. The Minister of Finance is too good, so he's under attack. The new head of the central bank is being appointed as yet because the people who are seeming possible now are too good. So it's clearly an attempt to reverse it by the current leaders. We need to distribute the fraud. But what can be done to break this up? The West won't do anything in this situation. I don't think that one should go for the West. So NATO, EU, that's not the solution. Something that could happen, it is follow Alexander Motil's line and say, give up Donbass, give it to Russia. This would clarify something, and it would deprive Poroshenko of standing as a war president. Could that be something to both of you? But or what else could be done to break the current very dreary stalemate as you so well illustrate?
Let's collect a couple, because I assume they'll be similar. There was over here, I think. Yeah, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. My name is Ted Kleister. I'm a military officer, served in the International War College, but I'm also a science alum. My question is for Professor Haran. If you could you elaborate on how the Russians would define a peacekeeping force? Would it be similar to what they call their peacekeepers in Moldova? How does that contrast with what the West would define as a peacekeeping force? Thank you.
All right. Okay. Why don't we take those? Oleksiy.
Okay, yes. With peacekeepers, so definitely Russia would like to present itself as a potential peacekeeper, like it happened in Moldova and Georgia, and definitely it's not acceptable for Ukraine and for the West as well. So I don't think that actually it would be debated in reality, because this is not acceptable. But Russian position regarding sudden change in Russia's position when Putin started to say, okay, I can accept this idea, is connected with interpretation of peacekeeping mission. And for him, peacekeeping mission is basically to put peacekeepers on the so-called contact line, full stop, which would mean freezing of the conflict, which, frankly speaking, I would say would not be bad. Again, because it would freeze the conflict and it would give possibility for Ukraine to concentrate on domestic changes, okay? But the idea of freezing the conflict in this way is very unpopular in Ukraine. It will not find support in Ukrainian public opinion, and I think it will not also be acceptable for the West if we analyze the effects of it, because we will have another frozen conflict for decades. That's why the position of Ukraine, and supported by the West, as far as I understand, by the United States and Germany, is that peacekeepers should be on the whole territory of the occupied Donbass, and they should be also on Russian-Ukrainian border, which is really, really important if we would like to stop the conflict. So that's the basic difference. If Russia would agree to that, many questions. Frankly speaking, I'm quite skeptical about that, but you know. So there would be a debate about that, maybe kind of compromise. I've read somewhere that maybe at the beginning there could be peacekeepers at the contact line, and then they may take the whole occupied Donbass and then move to Russian-Ukrainian border. I don't know. Regarding what can be done, Anders, this is a question we are putting to ourselves, you know, every day. If I had the answer, yeah, that would be good. But unfortunately, I would say that maybe this is only general, some general remarks. That again, in this situation, definitely what shouldn't be done, Maidan's so-called Maidan 3, would be totally destabilizing and totally dangerous. And there should be no talk about Maidan 3, which is so popular among Ukrainian opposition and radicals, because the nature is totally different. Maidan 1 and Maidan 2, they were the protest against attempts to create authoritarian government in Ukraine. There was no other channels to influence the government. And now we have different situation. Well, we have possibility to protest, and you see what Saakashvili is doing. This is unimaginable, actually, if we analyze what he is doing. The guy who is seeking to be a citizen of Ukraine, actually he's destabilizing Ukraine. He's proposing himself for Ukrainian prime minister. He is attacking the offices in the center of Kyiv. But still you have this possibility to protest, okay? So we shouldn't talk about Maidan 3, but about protests, yes. Potential mass protests, well, they could be. Although we see that the action of Saakashvili basically is not supported by Kyivites. This is very visible if you go there, if you see the numbers. So in this situation, I think there's no, as Mustafa Nayem once said, there should be Maidan in the parliament, within the parliament. I would extend it not only within the parliament, but also with the pressure from the civil society and the West. And in this situation, I think it could be helpful. You know, to support Nabu, yes, we see now clear attack against Nabu, to support Nabu, yes. okay, to make Western support dependent on 1, 2, 3, yes. To continue support to civil society, yes. So, and to support the reformers within the government, again, yes. Unfortunately, there would be no, just, one moment solution which will help us to change the situation. Even we don't see now potential, political force which could appear in the parliament and change situation, overnight. So it would be long fight, and we'll continue to put this question to us. I believe for several years, because it would be done in evolutionary way, not in revolutionary.
Mykola?
Thanks very much for your question. Thanks, Dr. Roslund. So before I want to say that all views are my own.
Everybody's views are there.
What we have right now, in the classic term, the definition of in the Western literature, academic life, is like liberal democracy. So basically now, we have Republican presidential, parliamentarian presidential republic, but now the president, he controls like everything. He appoints the governors, he has his main fraction, he makes money, he just controls oligarchs and so forth. And the recent attacks on Abu, the recent example during the global forum when Mr. Kholodnytsky and Mr. Sitnik were here, I think that only the Western pressure helped them to preserve their positions right now. So the government, the parliament, they didn't vote for them next day. That's it. So I think that the current leadership, they still look on what West thinks, especially in DC. So I think that a lot of solutions we can find actually here. So if you make strong pressure on corruption, on lack of reforms, and just personal attacking some who are involved, like Mr. Martynenko, Mr. Granovsky, everybody on all sides. I think that it might, Mr. General Prosecutor, and so forth. So I think that it might be helpful. In terms of protesting in Ukraine, so I wrote about this in my article also, that the numbers of people who are willing to go to protest before the Euromaidan revolution, it was up to 25%. Now it's up to 50%. 14% of the Institute of the Future, it's a think tank in Ukraine. Last year they made a survey. They said 14% are ready to go to protest with the weapon. So I want just to bring here that the situation is very tough. And people go to I'm not a fan of Saakashvili, despite I just admire what he did in Georgia. I think that he is a famous reformer in Georgia for his country. I think he's most populist in Ukraine, but most people go out not for Saakashvili. They go against lack of justice and so forth, against corruption. The same what happened during the revolution, Euromaidan. So people didn't went to Maidan for Yatsenyuk, for Tyagnybok, or for Poroshenko. They went against violences of the regime and about corruption. That's it. So all Saakashvili is trying to do right now is to be a face of this protest. It's just to try to repeat which was done during the Euromaidan revolution. So people mostly go to the streets not for somebody, but against the violations, against corruptions, and against injustice. That's it. So especially those people, and now we are saying many people are debating about how many people go to protest. So Saakashvili and let's say Saakashvili, many other street protesters, they don't bring many people. So 1 million people they won't take to the streets right now. But now it's not about the numbers of activists, but their quality. And some of them. So if it's gonna be another Maidan 3. It will be more bloody, maybe more fast, and nobody will have peaceful singing songs for 2.5 months. It will be something very quick, like a coup or something like this.
And who will come to power in this case?
That's the problem. That's why I'm trying just to write this question, saying that this is a big alarm right now, and the West should be aware of it. But in the end of the day, I think that just the West should somehow to intervene, somehow to push the president and the current leadership to make some changes, because otherwise I don't want my state to collapse and just Putin to be like a liberator or something like this. I don't want this. That's why I think that just combination of cooperation between the Western partners and the local activists, the true patriots, people who take to the streets, people who are in government, those people who care about this country, really, not the kleptocrats. That's like briefly.
Again, two brief points. I think it's good we have discussion
Absolutely.
between ourselves. That first of all, yes, people are protesting against corruption, against lack of rule of law, and this is actually good that they are protesting. What's Saakashvili's role here? Saakashvili is discrediting this protest, his participation.
Yeah.
And those who actually started this process recently, like Naem and Zalishuk and Leshchenko, with exception of Leshchenko, who I believe has now his own, agenda and approach, but they left it. They left it. They said, no, we are not with Saakashvili now. Okay, that's important. The second thing about Poroshenko, is he controlling everything? No, not at all. Is he trying to manipulate and increase his power? Yes, but he's not controlling everything. So you have totally different, because sometimes we hear in Ukraine that nothing has changed, Poroshenko is Yanukovych. Come on, guys, you couldn't protest like this under Yanukovych. You couldn't criticize president on all Ukrainian channels, including presidential channel. You can criticize Poroshenko there. So I see the problem is another one. The problem is actually that even whenever you have the idea of pushing forward important decisions, it's very difficult to do because you have this division of power, you need to have a coalition in the parliament, you need to have majority in the parliament, then you need to have court decisions, and so on and so forth. So again, he's not controlling everything, although there are dangers when he tries to manipulate something.
Yes, down here.
Thank you. I'm Shaska Byerly. I'm a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, but I'm also happily a non-resident fellow here at CTR, my second home. I have a question for both gentlemen, which is a potential Achilles heel for the kleptocrats that are in government in Ukraine. What do you think that international community can do to better go after the money that they are stealing out of the country and enriching themselves from their country that has not yet been done? We have, for example, here in the US, the Global Magnitsky Act. What are some of the things that you think that can be done that have not yet been done? Because if we're thinking about leverage on the part of the international community, one side of the leverage is to try to encourage or pressure actors within the government to take certain reforms and to carry them through or implement them. But then another side of the leverage is perhaps looking at their weak spots, which is all the money that is being stolen from the country. Thank you.
I'm Chris Bladowski from Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation. I'd like to come back to what Dan said. Dan said, one half of the question is what can the West do? And one area is in business and economics. On paper, at least, it seems to me that as the core Central Europe graduates out of the emerging market status, that Ukraine, particularly Ukraine more so than Moldova and Georgia, would be in a pole position to be tied into a big supply chain with Western Europe. So the question is there anything, say one of you mentioned the Eastern Partnership Plus, is there anything in the works that would make the investment and trade environment in Ukraine more receptive to the inflow of money? If the government is unstable in Kyiv and if there's an armed conflict in Donbass, that would deter investment and trade in its own right. But if you discount that, what is in the works to make the West or the Western business ties much more receptive to come to Ukraine in support of the economy?
Okay, do you want to take those? Before, I should just say, in the book, we actually have a couple articles on the economy, including by Natalie Yaresko, who was the former finance minister, who's now dealing with Puerto Rico and all of that. But I think there's some good analysis here on the economics, but let our colleagues engage on that.
Thank you for help, because I was thinking who would be able to answer these issues. There is another chapter, actually, by Igor Burakovsky, who's famous Ukrainian economist, about all these issues. So I think for this kind of discussion, next time invite one political scientist, one economist. Because frankly speaking, I'm in a difficult situation here to give some advice. I'm not, in business or economics. Some general things is that actually I think that the war in Donbass is not in reality an impediment for real investments. It's more like of psychological factor, because many people, they consider, oh, there is a war there. We will not go there. We will not go there for tourist purpose. I was, impressed when I met with a group of Dutch students who came to Kyiv, and they opened their eyes and they said, oh, it's so peaceful here. No problem, no war. How could it be? One time, I'm from time to time, I'm giving calls from different stations, including Al Jazeera. And they asked the question about the situation at the front line, and I said there's increasing shelling there, in Avdiivka, in Promzona. And they asked, oh, but you are based in Kyiv. I said, yes, I am. Is there any shelling in Kyiv as well? That gives the impression of how people assess the situation in Ukraine. They hear war, they immediately have this idea that you have war somewhere in the center of Ukraine, which is not the case. So basically, I believe the war in Donbass is not an impediment for investments. But the real impediment is the lack of rule of law. That's the answer. So you need to impose rule of law. You need to fight corruption, and this is the only way. You need to ease all this administrative burden, and it would be possible then for Western investors to come. Actually, some things are done, which are important also for small business. But given in general, general situation, so it prevents from increased influx of Western investment. And regarding financial controlling bodies, again, I believe I'm not a specialist here. I believe actually Americans know what to do and how to. You have very good bodies which know how to financially monitor and how to use it then in order to reach necessary results. Sorry, I cannot elaborate on that.
Mykola, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly. Thanks for your question, Sasha. And in terms of, so the main answer, just what happens right now, I mean, going back to the president, because at this historical moment of Ukraine history, and of course without any doubts of European history, because I believe that European future will be decided in Ukraine. So the person is trying just to combine politician and businessman in one person. That's it. And in terms of like what to do, I think that the West should pay more attention about dirty money which comes out from Ukraine. That's I think. And you have a lot good intelligence. I know all of this. So maybe not publicly, of course, because we don't want just to criticize like publicly Ukrainian government, Ukrainian citizen, because it will be play for Russians. But maybe just in private meetings to send some strong messages over these issues, saying like, guys, if you are saying that if you think that we are like all good with you and we support you, it doesn't mean that you just can use it as a, it doesn't mean that you can use, as some European parliamentarians said, that you can't use your country as ATM. That's probably, and it should be, of course, it won't be, I don't think it should be publicly, but the president and other leadership people, they come here, they come to DC, so it should be a strong message. That's it, because it's gonna be, like, it's gonna be, otherwise it will be a reason of another, like some developments, like in country, like, and of course, like those people, I don't support any kind, well, protest is good, but those people, there are a lot of has been changed, like since the Euromaidan revolution, but you see these changes, you have to deliver it somehow to people. So people don't see the improvement of their lives. And many of them, they're like desperate, so they see the protests as the only one way to make a difference or to influence some politicians or to stop some injustice. That's it. So I think that the West, what they can do is just to address like directly to those people. We know these names. We know where they hold their assets and so forth. We should send them a strong message. And in terms of your question about business in Ukraine, I believe that the country is very like strong with the potential economically and so forth. But we should do something. Obviously we should finish this war, but we should. I'm not a businessman, but if you want to invest in any country, so where you go first? You go first to Index of Doing Business and then Transparency International. And if you see what places Ukraine holds right now, so you won't be happy with this. But so I think that we should just to improve somehow the situation. And we have a lot of examples. And we have a lot of bright, very successful and noble advisors. But it's still up to the political leadership. They have to change first. That's it. So I think the society is ready for changes. The European Union is ready, all the West is ready, but we should do something about the leadership, somehow to conduct more like pressure, some force. Thank you.
Okay, as to indexes, Doing Business is a really good index. By the way, Ukraine improved, not very dramatically, unfortunately. As to Transparency International Index, there is, I believe, some problem with that. And the problem is the following. Because it's about not corruption per se, but it's about perception of corruption, okay? So what does it mean? Let me explain. That compared to Yanukovych era, corruption has been reduced in Ukraine. Will you agree to that, Anders?
If you take the total amount of bribes, but not if you take the total number of bribes.
Okay. Okay, but perception of corruption among Ukrainian public increased. Why? Because under Yanukovych it wasn't possible to openly talk about it on most media channels. And now you're talking about it everywhere. So people hear about it every day, several times. The scandals connected to corruption. So in their perception, corruption definitely increased.
You know, on Shaska, if I could just say, I have a chapter in here too with my co-editor, Stefan Meister, on just framing the issues. And on corruption, I think what we try to say is there are a lot of things we tell the Ukrainians they have to do, but how credible are we if we trumpet the need for them to do anything, and yet Western financial and banking systems are complicit in all of this? So. And also in our first book, I mean, part of what we talked about is not just what the East has to do, but what the West has to do. And there are a lot of things we could do. Simply enforce our own laws would be one. And also crack down on our own systems that facilitate and are complicit with these flows of funding. So we don't have to wait for Ukraine to get its act together when we could do some things on our own. And that was the point Stefan and I had made about sort of Western co-ownership of the reform process, that we have to feel, I would agree with Mykola just said, he kind of let it slip by, I don't know if people got that. Ukraine is the future of the European project. And I just let that, I really believe that. Yet that's not how it's being seen, back to perception. So let me just ask you, because the chapter Stefan and I have, it says Eastern Voices, but the rest of the title says, Is the West Listening? And I think, you know, you're here now in Washington, Oleksiy, and so let me put this back to you. I mean, hearing all the problems, hearing all of these things, you know, someone who's not focused on Ukraine has got to sort of say, oh my God, you know, they've got work to do. We'll come back to you in a, you know, next decade. And put it, you know, try to put it in the perspective of what's happening in the West, which is we have huge debates going on in this country about even, you know, where we even participate as a country anymore. The president's releasing his national security strategy today. I've been calling the Trump sort of view as selective burden shedding, which is what I think what they're up to. So, you know, Ukraine could be one of these burdens you shed in an overall approach, because why would we engage given all of this problem? And then you turn to the European Union and our colleagues in Western Europe. They are distracted, frankly, by a conflation of crises that has turned them inward. Germany doesn't even have a government, and that's the main you know, country working on the Minsk things. Poland, who has been the Ukraine's champion, is basically not playing that role right now. In fact, it's aggravating issues. So you've lost the kind of agents of help, and I don't want to call them agents, but the sort of your partners in the West who have been playing up the Ukrainian cause. And if I think about this European Commission, and frankly I would go as far to say the next European Commission, so we're talking about 7 years or more, the enlargement option isn't on the table. The Eastern Europe Partnership Summit, Anders had a good piece on it, if people haven't seen it, which was, it slipped everybody's attention, and I think you said, Anders, for good reason, you didn't miss anything, right? So it's the old structures, the approaches aren't working, and we're both so distracted, the US and Europe, the rest of Western Europe, that, you know, it's still this question, why should we care when there's so many problems going on in Ukraine? So what's your answer to, you know, your Western colleagues on that issue?
So, okay, the picture you have described actually is not as gloomy as it was seen a year ago. Okay, when there was uncertainty about elections in France, in Netherlands, in Germany, and what Trump will do. Okay, remember what he said about Crimea during presidential campaign and about canceling sanctions against Russia. So it's not as gloomy, I would say. Vice versa, it showed that, as I have said, I think now there's more the West now better understands what's going on in the Donbass and what should be done. Okay, the West better accepts Ukrainian arguments regarding potential solution of the war in the Donbass. And why the West should care, we know why, because this is about stability in Europe, actually. And Ukraine, again, Ukraine is not lost. Yes, there's a lot of fatigue, and I would add more, there's a lot of frustrations among Ukrainians. No, I put this question all the time to me, what's going on? What should we do? So it's not easy, you know, to answer for a person who's been at Euromaidan, at the front line. And I'm debating it with my colleagues, and the answer is, yeah, there's no quick answer, we need to work. And again, the country has done a lot, civil society has done a lot. There is a trust toward volunteers, there is trust toward NGOs. The country is changing. Okay, if we compare it with Yanukovych, it changed dramatically. And even if President Poroshenko would like to concentrate the power in his hands, he would not be able to do it. He would not be able, as simple as that. So, again, the glass is half full, more than half, I would say. Yes, there's no quick also remedies for Western policy regarding Ukraine. We need to prepare for a long work. Unfortunately, Ukrainian elites showed that they are not really ripe for radical transformation of the country. So, but it could be done in evolutionary way. And despite all the problems that that the West has now, I think that there is an understanding that that support to Ukraine should be continued, but conditioned on what Ukraine is doing. So I think this conditionality is important.
Okay, Mykola?
Yeah, briefly answering to your question, I think what Ukraine can give to the West and what is the fighting all about right now. Well, I mean, it's about values. I think that the Western civilization versus like dictatorship at like Asian type of civilization. So Russia is an empire which is collapsing right now, and that's why they're fighting right now to preserve somehow which they consider their territories right now. So if Ukraine wins, the whole West wins. If Ukraine loses, I mean, I don't know what will be the outcomes. But I have some brief example. So if you go, let's say, even in the front lines, so I've heard many stories from there. And first volunteer battalions, let's say, which were organized in summer 2014, and when Russians, they say that the Donbass, it's very Russian speakers and they want Russia to come there and so forth, 80% of the first battalion, Donbass battalion, which was created, it was summer in the beginning of conflict, 80% of them, they were local population. I met some people who fight literally for their house because their house is in 1 mile behind the front lines on that side. And in the volunteer battalions, and now we implemented the law which allows to international volunteers to serve in Ukrainian army. And you can make there, even right now, I mean, many people say about right sector, even right now, you see there and Ukrainians. You see there Russians, Belarusians, you see like, even like, I saw some like Australian guy, German guy. So they fight for these values. They learn, they study Ukrainian language, they study Ukrainian culture, and they sacrifice their lives for this. So I think this matters. And what Ukraine can give for the West, and what it gives to the West, it's a one world, hope.
Yeah, I think values are really important. So this is existential, and we Ukrainians are very naive to believe in values now, and to believe that the West does believe in values. But we know that for some presidents of great countries, it's much more important about interests than values. So we are to actually to tell that this is in the interest of the West, to have stable Ukraine, to have stability in Europe, and not to appease Russia. This is in Western interests.
Okay. Well, there are copies of the book on the table. I think Sim picked it up. It's also fully accessible on our website, transatlanticrelations.org. So you can also do individual chapters, including the one by Oleksiy. And I want to thank everyone for coming. We'll continue on this series. As I said, actually, we're about to release the next book on Russia, which we'll do in January. We'll send you a note about that with a somewhat different debate, probably. But it'll probably also include discussion of Ukraine. And Mykola is here all year with us, and I look forward to featuring him in some additional panels. Thanks again for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you, and please.
Thank you.
Дуже дякую вам.
Та я вам
Велика
дякую.
честь.
Да.
Гарна дискусія.
Да.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks
Yeah,
very much.
yeah.